Hi, everyone. My name is Paula Wilson, and I am Equity Arc's Member Services and Communications Manager. I'm joined today by our Executive Director, Stanford Thompson, and Associate Director, Magee Capsuto. Thanks all for joining for this timely conversation on affirmative action and the impact that the ruling has on music schools. We know that this topic is especially critical to our collegiate and pre-college members. So we assembled an amazing group of DEI, admissions, higher education, and legal experts to shed some light on your pressing questions. So I'll walk us through our agenda for the next hour and a half. We'll begin with the legal overview of the affirmative action ruling, so we can have a clear understanding of what affirmative action is and what exactly is impacted. Then our panelists will engage in a discussion facilitated by Dr. China Wilson. Following the panel, we'll answer some questions from our attendees and then break out into groups for focused conversation on topics that are relevant to this session. We'll come back to share insights that we learned and then end our time together with some announcements. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tiffany Wright to provide some legal context for today's conversation.
Thank you, Paula, and hello, everybody. I am Tiffany Wright. I'm the Deputy General Counsel for the Johns Hopkins University and very happy to be here with all of you today. As Paula said, I'm going to give some legal background on the opinion just to do some table setting for our discussion. Please do feel free if you have questions about anything that I say to drop a question, and I'm happy to answer those as we go along. So starting from the very beginning, whenever we talk about race-conscious admissions, we're dealing with really two sources of law, the first being the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which was ratified in the wake of the Civil War and intended to provide for full democratic participation and integration into social life for formerly enslaved persons. And the Equal Protection Clause governs public institutions, state, federal agencies, as well as state and federal public colleges and universities. And it means that you cannot treat people differently on the basis of race. So that's the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which governs public universities and colleges and programs. Then we have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was passed as part of this country's second Reconstruction period following the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And Title VI governs private institutions. So any program or activity that receives federal funding, even if it is private, is governed by Title VI. And Title VI has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to mean roughly the same thing as the Equal Protection Clause in this context, which is you cannot treat people differently on the basis of race. For many, many decades, starting at least in 1978 with an opinion called Bakke, which was based out of the University of California's medical school, the Supreme Court had said the Equal Protection Clause and Title VI permitted colleges and universities to consider race as one of many factors in determining whom to admit to their programs as part of a holistic review of each individual applicant. And that was the law for many, many decades since 1978. That changed on June 29th of this year, where the Supreme Court largely reversed course. And in looking at two programs out of Harvard, a private university governed by Title VI, and the University of North Carolina, a public university governed by the Equal Protection Clause, the court decided as to both of these institutions that the consideration of race as one of many factors in holistic review processes was no longer permissible under the Equal Protection Clause or Title VI. And the court reached that opinion for three reasons that I will try to summarize very quickly. The first reason being the court said, whenever we have a consideration of race in any context, it has to be examined and survive what is called strict scrutiny, which is the highest form of legal or constitutional scrutiny that the Supreme Court will perform. And what it means is the consideration of race has to be necessary in order to achieve some compelling interest. So here, the compelling interest that the court had recognized was colleges and universities have an interest in obtaining the educational benefits of diversity. What the court said in these recent cases is that there is no measurable and concrete data that establishes that the consideration of race is necessary to obtain the goal of diversity. The second thing the court said was race-conscious admissions programs, such as the ones at Harvard and UNC, were using race as a negative and engaging in stereotyping. So the court said that the programs were using race as a negative because college admissions or program admissions are zero-sum. And so whenever you provide a benefit to one student, you are necessarily disadvantaging another student. The court also said that race-conscious admissions programs engage in stereotypes because they operate on the assumption in the court's view that a Black student, for example, can necessarily provide something to your program that a white student cannot. And the court said that that is impermissible stereotyping. The final thing the court said was that these programs are operating with no logical endpoint. And so you'll recall that I mentioned a case called Baki that first established the permissibility of race-conscious admissions. It was followed by a case called Grutter in 2003, where in upholding the use of race-conscious admissions, the court said that it had an expectation that within 25 years of 2003, we will have advanced as a society such that the consideration of race was no longer necessary to achieve the educational benefits of diversity. And here, in this year, in 2023, the court said, we're coming up on that 25-year expectation, and neither Harvard nor UNC could provide the court with a date certain by which they would stop the consideration of race. And so in the court's view, there was no logical endpoint to those programs. And so the court declared them impermissible and unlawful under both the Equal Protection Clause and Title VI. So following, and we'll talk more as we go along about what all the impacts are, but the broad holding of the court is that the consideration of race in admissions, if it does not meet these three requirements that the court laid out, surviving strict scrutiny, not using race as a negative or a stereotype, and having a logical endpoint. If those three things are not satisfied, then the use of race is impermissible going forward. And I'll stop there because I think I'm almost at my five-minute limit, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And as I said, we'll talk more going forward about what all the implications of that might be.
Special thanks to Tiffany. Thank you so much for that wonderful overview. As she said, we're going to dive deeper. I'm sure many of you have questions and are wondering if she can elaborate perhaps on a few things, but we're going to transition to our panel discussion where hopefully you'll be able to get some of those questions answered. Tiffany is one of our panelists as well, so you will continue to hear from her as well as the other panelists. My name is China Wilson, and I am the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Peabody Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And so really happy to have all of you with us this afternoon. And we're going to kind of jump right in. To start us off, I will be serving as our panelist, or excuse me, our facilitator rather, for the time that we'll be discussing this topic. And we have a number of panelists that are going to be joining us. And so I'm going to quickly tell you who they are, and then I'm going to ask that they introduce themselves, and then we will jump right on in with the content and the questions that we have for today. So our panelists are Scott Harrison, Espen Jensen, Dr. Crystal Sellers-Battle, of course, Tiffany Wright, who you just heard from, and of course, myself as the facilitator, China Wilson. And so with that being said, I guess I'll toss it over to Scott to have him introduce himself, and then we can popcorn and have the other panelists introduce themselves as well.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Tiffany, that was so helpful. I appreciate just the clarity of your summation. I'm the Executive Vice President and Provost at the Cleveland Institute of Music. We are a private institution in terms of that framework you just heard of private versus public. And of course, we are independent in the fact that we're not affiliated or a part of a larger university or institution. So we are essentially the collegiate level, just the conservatory. So that just gives you a little sense of us, because I know it's important to understand the context of each institution, because that shades what some of the policies, the bureaucracy, the procedure are you have to deal with. Anyway, that's me. It's great to be here.
Espen?
Hello, everyone. My name is Espen Jensen, and I am the Director of Admissions and Financial Aid here at the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music. And different from Scott's description, then we represent the public university profile of this discussion. So we are a conservatory-like school within Indiana University, which is a large Big Ten campus, part of the Indiana University system here. So 40,000 students on campus with a large conservatory unit of 1,600 students, graduate and undergraduate. Very glad to be here. Looking forward to our discussion.
Good morning, well, afternoon now, everyone. I am Crystal Sellers-Battle. I'm the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion at Eastman School of Music. And we have the unique context of being a part of a private institution that is a part of a larger private institution. So Eastman School of Music is a part of University of Rochester, a Research One institution in northern part of New York. I am thrilled to be here and be a part of this conversation and excited to hear all the things that will come out of it. So lovely to meet you all.
And Tiffany?
Sure. Hello again, everybody. As I said, I'm Tiffany Wright. I'm the Deputy General Counsel at Johns Hopkins University. I will let Dr. Wilson tell you about our Peabody Institute, but I'm very glad to be here with you and be helpful in the legal arena as much as I can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tiffany. Again, China Wilson, Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Peabody Institute at Johns Hopkins University. This is excitingly an inaugural role. I am 9 months in, and so we are excited at Peabody to have such a role, a strategic role that sits on the executive team to help streamline DEI into everything that we do. And so my role works alongside the other deans to really embed all that we do around DEI into everything at Peabody. Peabody constitutes the Peabody Conservatory side as well as the Preparatory side, which is where we have our high school students and some of our elementary students partaking in music and dance and so forth. And so we bring the Preparatory and the Conservatory together to call it the Peabody Institute. We are located in Baltimore, Maryland. We are one of 9 divisions within the Johns Hopkins University community. And so that's a little bit about us and a little bit about kind of how things operate at Peabody. We are now going to move into our discussion. There are a number of topics that we thought might be helpful, but we have about 35 minutes. And so what we're going to try to do is get through as many of these great questions as possible. And if we linger on a question because it's just a hot topic, so be it. And so we'll move forward with the first one. And the first question is really the impact of the ruling, right? And the specific question to the panelists: how has your institution responded to this recent Supreme Court ruling?
Well, I guess I can jump in here. I will say that University of Rochester and Eastman all collectively really took some time to pause. What we were afraid was going to happen is that there would be a bit of a panic in how do we respond immediately. How much is it going to change our admissions process and role, especially here at Eastman? And so one of the things that our president and our provost here at University of Rochester and also our dean at Eastman School of Music did really well was conveying the message that we just need a little bit of time to sort through what exactly we're being asked to do. And then once we have those answers, we'll be able to give you a clear and concise, but also informative way of how this process was going to work moving forward. So I was actually very excited to hear that we were taking kind of a calculated response to it rather than an immediate, we need to change everything immediately panic moment. And so that was a really great way for us to put things together. And they've been taking the time to really investigate what needed to happen and came up with a great answer. So I'll share a little bit about that later.
I can hop in for CIM. And I feel like every time I talk, I should preface by saying I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an admissions professional. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I think there's a similar spirit. We leaned into if you think about affirmative action, the first word's affirmative. It's a positive statement. It's about doing something good and it's about finding opportunities. And so we talked a lot about how so many things that we do to create and build and sustain racially diverse and socioeconomically diverse and geographically diverse classes are about growing the pool and about bringing more people in. It's about creating pathways and opportunities. when you really think about it, at the end of the day, and I don't know if everyone would answer this the same way, but in music admissions, arguably, we're one of the least race conscious admissions process to begin with. We have an audition that, and the studio teachers are sort of making their decisions about who belongs in that pool, and that's really driving that decision process. And we felt our process was very defensible, and many things that we do to create diversity in the pool, to create opportunities so that individuals can attend the school and have the financial resource. We're going to get to all this later, but we thought so many things we do actually already been spoken to in the case. And the case, in a way, was so narrow as to not preclude us from continuing to seek amazing musicians of all races, backgrounds, talents, stories, etc., to be part of our school. So that was some of our initial thinking.
Any other comments on this particular question from the panelists? All right, so we're going to move on to the next topic then. So it's financial aid implications, right? And that question is, will the ruling impact race-based financial aid or scholarships? This is probably a big question for our participants that are joining us. And so feel free, panelists, to jump in and provide your perspective on that question. Will the ruling impact race-based financial aid or scholarships?
I can start by talking a little bit about us here at Indiana University and the Jacobs School. So at the moment, no, it really does not affect what we do. And we are, of course, sort of layered in the sense that we are have to answer to both state law, public law, federal law, etc. So the programs that we have in place that are related or that are not related really have not been impacted by this, and we're glad about that, of course.
Eastman has historically taken the role of awarding scholarship and financial aid from a merit-based process that is need-informed. So race was not one of the characteristics under which financial aid was being awarded. And so we'll continue that method of merit-based, need-informed.
Okay, any other perspectives? I'd like to pause for a moment if we can and allow Tiffany to elaborate. She had just 5 minutes at the beginning. So whenever I see an opportunity to plug in her expertise, I'd like to do so. There's some additional information I think it might be helpful for everyone to be aware of when it comes to scholarships and this notion that she shared with us about tangible benefits. And so if you could take just a moment, Tiffany, and just maybe give folks an overview of that, of some helpful information around that concerning the ruling.
Sure. So like every lawyer, I have to start with a disclaimer, which is I'm about to tell you my opinion based on my reading of the opinion and my work in this area, and not about any privileged communications or advice that I've given to the university. And so helpfully, the Department of Education and the Department of Justice put out joint guidance on this that was really helpful. And I think if you review that guidance and you distill it down, what you can see is that the impact of this decision, although this was a decision that was made in the context of admissions processes at undergraduate institutions, the impact ripples out to touch other things. And so what it comes down to, given Title VI generally, the Equal Protection Clause generally, and what the court said in the opinion, is that we have to be careful whenever we are talking about giving a concrete or tangible benefit to students, right? Whenever that is financial aid, scholarships, preparatory programs, anything that is concrete and tangible. And I hate to keep using those words, but they're the words that best describe what I'm getting at, right? And so scholarships, financial aid, fellowships are things that we should really be removing the consideration of race to the extent that they were considered at all, is something that we have to be careful about. The good news is that something like targeted recruitment, it's not something that I would think involves a tangible benefit, right? So going out into communities of color, into certain undergraduate or high school institutions and letting diverse students know we want you here. We would love to see you in our program. We strongly encourage you to apply to our program. Here is everything we can tell you about it, and just trying to expand your applicant pool and the pool of interest. And hopefully that will filter down as something that is not impacted, in my view, by the decision. But it's when you get into application processes, whether it's for money, mentor, like any program benefit that you have at your institution, that is where the consideration of race has to be removed. And I've heard a lot in the discourse following the decision, things like, well, our program doesn't just consider race, we consider all of these other forms of diversity. And that is wonderful, because diversity is something that has many facets, but the import of the court's decision is that the consideration of race has to disappear essentially entirely. So you can continue to consider other forms of diversity, but this is one thing we cannot continue to consider. But as I said, the silver lining, to the extent that there is one, is that there's no impact on targeted recruitment. There's no impact on stating that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is a primary goal of your institution. There is nothing stopping you from doing DEI training and making it very known that this is a institutional priority and value. And nothing in the court's opinion impacted that at all.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Hopefully that information helps folks understand, things to explore, steps to take potentially within your communities. And so if there is nothing else to be shared on that particular topic, we can move to the next one. And that next question is additional implications, right? So what does the ruling mean? And this is for all panelists. For preparatory, summer, and other non-collegiate programs. Question again, what does the ruling mean for preparatory, summer, and other non-collegiate programs? Any of the panelists can weigh in at this time.
Well, I have a thought about this based on some of the discussions we've had at CIM, and I think they sort of follow, it sort of draws a line from what Tiffany was just sharing. We've had a lot of conversation about a lot of responding to a legal ruling is sort of talking about risk tolerance and values at an institution. Like we all want a magic bullet, like this is the answer, you can do X, Y, and Z, and you can't do A, B, and C. That doesn't necessarily exist, right? And so you have to sort of talk about, like, what are the values, what do we really want to create, and where does our risk tolerance lie? So we've had conversations that you can read the decision in a way that it does not preclude a collegiate institution like CIM, which has a preparatory program, to have a race-based preparatory program. That is an interpretation, but it's also saying that might be the next thing that is challenged, and that challenge might come in 6 months or a year or 5 years, or there might be a ruling from your state entity, and your state funding might be, as you've seen in certain states, your state funding might be in jeopardy. So there's what we've talked about is there's a lot of tea leaves to read in this situation, a lot of sort of personal decisions. And we feel confident at CIM right now that the way, our pathway program, the way it's designed, we think it's defensible, we think it's appropriate. We are having some conversations if there's ways to create more space in it that we probably didn't imagine originally as a way to sort of expand, but we're also aware that something might happen at some point. But we also have said, well, if in 5 years we can't run that program, we still get a leg up of having 5 years of putting amazing young people into that program and getting them into the world, because ultimately, like, that's the change that matters. If, like, our institutions and all their facets sort of are and represent what, being diverse means, what being equitable means, what having an amazing Black experience means, what having an amazing Latino experience means, etc. Those are the things that could potentially be the bolsters against prohibitions that may at one point come in that say you can't do X or you can't do Y.
Scott, I thank you for saying that, because I think the other response that we had when we were thinking about what this ruling would mean is that we almost felt like we needed to operate in a space of fear to stifle progress, because we were afraid that some of the things that we were doing were eventually going to get us into trouble. And so I think what's been wonderful is this thought that really what is being said is not going to limit what we're doing to prepare the next generation. Because realistically, when we think about the next set of students and the demographic cliff that we've so many times heard about, we have to think about that those students that are going to be college aged and eligible are going to look a little different. And so we're kind of in this catch-22, but it's good that we can still continue to think about how we prepare them, so that when they become a part of the programs, that we have really set them up for the best level of success. So thank you for saying that, Scott. That's great.
Just one more, this is sort of legal commentary, and it is that all of these lawsuits, these two, the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC, the Fisher cases before that, and since those lawsuits, the folks who manufactured those claims, who went out and found those plaintiffs and paid for those lawsuits, they have been trying to create an atmosphere of fear. That is the goal. The goal is to make everyone afraid of saying the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think one thing that we can all think about, and this goes to, Scott, your point about institutional risk tolerance and where you want to be, is yes, we want to follow the law, but keep in mind that the whole purpose of what is happening is to create an environment where we're not moving the ball forward and we're not doing anything. So we should, instead of operating from the frame of what can't we do, challenges create opportunities, and now is the time for people to get really creative about what is possible, notwithstanding the threats and what is coming out of the legal community. And so just wanted to put that out there, that I love that that's the frame we should be looking at this from, is what can we do to improve on the progress we've already made.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that, Tiffany, so much so. I would encourage folks, as I encourage myself, to focus on what the ruling does say that we can do. For example, Tiffany mentioned that we can, do outreach. We can, reach out to targeted groups. And so where there are some limitations when it comes to decision-making of who gets into the program, they're not limiting who we can reach out to, right? So what that means is we're going to have to put our thinking caps on, and we're going to have to get real strategic, right, about the groups that we know that we want to be a part of these preparatory groups, these summer groups, and these non-collegiate groups, right? It was an easy way, perhaps in the past, to make a quick decision based off race. We can no longer do that. And so now we're going to have to kind of roll up those elbows, get those, get in and really strategize collectively, not just within your office, but within offices at your institution. How do we partner so that there's a collective effort to do outreach and to do targeting, building awareness and targeted outreach to groups that we know we want to be a part of these programs. It may take some time to see the results of it, right? So you may not get an instant win, but I believe if we're strategic, by and by there will be a win, right? And so if we can just hold on to what the ruling is saying that we can do, in addition to being mindful of how to be compliant of what we cannot do, right? Going to that positive versus negative thinking, just to kind of add on to that. Any other thoughts about this particular topic, this particular question, before we move forward? All right, looks like we can move to the next one.
I do have to share something else.
Sure.
I'm getting so inspired by what you both just said, and I'm feeling the energy, and I'm going to make a plug that doesn't benefit me, but it just has to be right next to my desk. I know a lot of people in this call know Chris Jenkins, right? That's a familiar name. Amazing musician, scholar, author, activist, associate dean at Oberlin, our friends down the street. And he just wrote an amazing new book called Assimilation versus Integration in Music Education. And he just came and presented on this at CIM for about 100 faculty and staff, to that point of like the trainings and the conversations you can have. And he made this point, which is a version of what you just said, China. So I'm not trying to take credit. I'm trying to pass this along. He said, a lot of institutions got really good at demographic diversity, and they stopped there. And it's like, how can you actually build the aesthetics and the environment so that people feel welcome? And it's not just about, color
Absolutely.
of skin or checking a box on a certain form, but it's like they're actually there. And a ruling like this challenges us to actually dive deeper
Absolutely.
into that work and not stop at demographic diversity, but do the sort of equitable change that actually makes the long-term difference.
Absolutely, Scott. You're spot on. You're spot on, my friend. That's exactly what it forces us to do. And so it's a new day now for us to put systems in place so that when we recruit, we can retain and have sense of belonging and all of the like around promoting true DEI true diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campuses. Doesn't mean the battle's over as far as it'll be easy and simplified. It just means that we get closer to reaching a holistic goal rather than just focusing on getting folks there based on race, if that makes sense. So thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. And certainly a plug for that resource there was super helpful. So I guess we'll move to the next topic, and that is advice to students. The question to the panelists: how would you advise prospective students of color to approach their applications in the coming years? Again, how would you advise prospective students of color to approach their application in the coming years?
I can probably start us off there. And first of all, I would say when it comes to the application itself, make sure you share as much about yourself as you can as the application gives you the opportunity to. For instance, here at our school, we have expanded on both the prompt and the opportunity to write an essay in the application. That's a great opportunity for any applicant to really just share information. We ask about it as well, about any challenges, anything that they think is relevant to the process going forward. And then kind of at a more personal level, don't be shy about reaching out throughout the process, whether that is to an office such as ours or another administrative office. That's certainly fine, and we're here to help in every way we can. But be sure to reach out to the faculty as well if you'd like. Don't be shy about asking for trial lessons, Zoom lessons, or meetings. And just make sure that you're sort of being as active as possible in the process to just learn as much and just be part of. Think of it as a journey as you go through the process of going into a conservatory or a music school. And it's a journey. It's going to take some time. It's actually longer than most application processes for a college or university, but it's very interactive when it really comes down to it. There's a lot of opportunity to learn. One way for us to learn about you, but for you to really learn about us as well, and seize that opportunity as much as you can.
While it may feel like it would be an opportunity to not be authentically yourself, I think I would say to students, be authentically yourself. There is an aspect that there's a button or a check mark that you're no longer able to fill on the application. But I think being authentically yourself is really the part that is going to be important. If you're leaving any aspect of your identity, whether they are asking for it or not, outside of the application process, then you're not able to convey the authentic version of you. And so what I think is really important is telling students, be authentically yourself, because what we don't want you to feel like is like, oh, I have to hide this portion of my identity. I have to hide this portion of my socioeconomic status. I have to hide this portion of my geography. Then we don't get the true essence of who you are. Just because we are not to consider it in the decision of accepting you or not, what we do want to know is we want to know who you are authentically, fully, and what inspires you to be the musician that you are. And for some people, that may be a portion of their race and ethnicity. I know for me, what interested me in becoming a voice major was actually growing up singing gospel. But that's what got me into singing classical voice. And so it would have been hard for me to leave that aspect of myself outside of my introduction to the schools that I went to, because it was very much an integral part of who I became. And so I think be authentically yourself. Don't feel like you have to hide that portion of yourself just because that's a decision that has been made.
And thankfully, and this speaks to the value of diversity, because as a result of a line of questioning from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the majority was really forced to include a very helpful paragraph, which is to say that the Chief Justice's opinion, which was joined by the 5 other justices, said that nothing prohibits programs from considering an applicant's discussion of how their race may have impacted them or shaped them as an individual. And so one thing that I worry about is that in the wake of this decision, students, diverse students particularly, will feel like there are parts and aspects of themselves that they will have to hide, that can't be considered. And that's not exactly true. And so it is permissible legally for folks to provide opportunities explicitly for students to tell you about how aspects of their identity, including race, among many others, may have shaped them as an individual, may have inspired them to study what they want to study in your program, may have forced them to be determined in a particular kind of way. And so those opportunities should be provided and can be considered in admissions decisions consistent with the court's opinion. What we can't do is if a student discloses, for example, in an essay that they are Black, we can't consider that. But if they say, I am Black, and as was just said, because of my culture growing up singing gospel, that part of my culture has inspired me so much, you can consider that. Because it tells you something about that person as a unique individual, and that is permissible. And I think we should get that message out there so that students know you don't have to hide who you are and how you are unique in the application process.
I think what I'm about to say is probably bad legal advice, but great artistic advice. And that is words like compelling interest and strict scrutiny. It's like when you apply compelling interest and strict scrutiny to art requires diversity. Art requires many different people from many different parts of the world with many different life experiences, bringing themselves forward to contribute to the art form and communicate with audiences who are incredibly diverse. So, you know, I just want to echo everything. And I'm thinking a lot about what Crystal said. Like, it's so scary. Like I try, I don't know if it works, but I try to empathize and sympathize. Like, it's scary as I hate to say I'm middle-aged, but it's scary as a middle-aged white guy to bring yourself, right? And I can only imagine how if you're an 18 or 19-year-old person of color, maybe even a woman of color, how much more scarier that could be. An LGBTQ plus woman of color, like how scary that concept can be. So I don't want to all pretend it's easy or say, well, just, you know, bring yourself. But hopefully it helps the more of us who say this and the more people trust. And I hope that, you know, young people are seeing people they trust when they come to these schools, because that adds to my other point. I remember we talked about this a little bit at the Equity Art Conference last year in Cincinnati, that next year in Nashville, or this year in Nashville. So that's going to be good eating. But, you know, this idea of like really like evaluate the schools, like, yeah, it's not enough to evaluate the teacher. Like, yes, the teacher matters. Yes, you know, all those elements matter, but like evaluate the school. You know, is that school environment? Do they have the programs, the processes, the elements, the things, the students, the culture, the space you're looking for? And maybe the truth is, maybe CIM has a teacher you love, but maybe CIM isn't actually what you need when you look at all those elements. Maybe it's Eastman and maybe it's vice versa. But really look at all those things, you know, and make sure the school is going to, you'll see the clues if you look really carefully. So that'd be my other piece of advice, is really look broadly and look widely.
Another thing that schools are going to be forced to do is not to think about just making the room look different, but actually feel different. And so making sure that you're going to a school that makes you feel as if your presence is making the room feel different too, not just look different. And that's really important. So are there services and supports, just as Scott was mentioning, that are going to help you thrive, not only just be there and barely survive and hang on, but actually to thrive through your, you know, educational experience and making sure that you feel fully supported and that your presence there is beyond just making the room look different, but feeling different.
This is awesome. This is so awesome. One thing I'll add before we conclude on this topic is to piggyback on all the panelists have said. I think one of the action items that it might be worth exploring or engaging with your internal team is to determine how the institution will move forward in encouraging students in the application process to share stories or life experiences based on a group that they, including race that they may belong to. How is that experience contributed to their uniqueness, contributed to their resilience or anything of the like? Maybe exploring the ruling, talks about potential essay questions and things like that on the application. Schools will have to determine whether that's the route they want to go in. For example, providing one of three options. You pick the essay, topic or question you want to answer. And so if that's what your school tries to do or attempts to do or explores doing, it might be worth having the admissions team work with the folks in DEI to really kind of make sure that there's a standard message, if you will, shared when you go out and you do your outreach. And so that folks are given examples of, a lot of times a 17 or 18-year-old, they're thinking about a lot of things when it comes to college. And so you might need to help them along the way to understand, think of a life experience, think of a journey that you've had that makes you unique, especially when it comes to the arts, that makes you resilient, right? And then that student can answer whatever essay question they want. Not that you're forcing them to answer that question, but at least equip them with the steps that they would take to reason with what essay question they may or may not want to address, and how they may be able to use, a particular experience that they're not even aware of that they had, as a way to talk about how unique they are, and why that uniqueness is something that you would want at your school. So I will, share that piece, and then we, believe it or not, have come to the end of our panel discussion. The time went by faster than perhaps we all thought. Real good dialogue, real good content shared. And so at this time, we're going to allow participants to ask questions of the panelists. So we're going to take about 5 minutes. If you'd like to drop a question in the chat box, that would be awesome. And we will get those as many questions as we can asked, within the 5 minutes that we have. And so I'll turn it over to Paula at this time to facilitate that Q&A session.
Awesome. As Dr. Wilson said, you can either put your question in the chat or you can unmute. We have an amazing panel of experts, so let us know what you'd like to know. Does this ruling impact hiring practices as well?
So no, I mean, this not directly. The decision was made as a Title VI and equal protection decision in the context of admissions. And so there is no direct impact from this decision on hiring practices. What I will say, though, is that Title VII generally governs employment practices and has its own prohibition on the consideration of race. And the same lawyers that did these two lawsuits against Harvard and UNC recently, 2 weeks ago, sued two major law firms, saying that their DEI programs and fellowships were unlawful under Title VII, as well as the Equal Protection Clause. And so while these decisions, because they were decided in the context of admissions and students and programs like that, do not have an impact on employment directly, you should know that there are legal implications there. And I would just advise consulting with your internal counsel, because there are scary things on the horizon and things that you might want to consider doing now in order to provide some insulation.
Okay, great. I'll pause for just a few more moments to see if there are any questions, general thoughts for the panel, and then we can move on to our next part of the conversation.
Paul, I think there's one more question. Someone was asking about the title of the book that Scott referenced earlier.
Yes.
I just typed it in. It's Assimilation versus Integration in Music Education by Chris Jenkins. And I learned it's a good plug. I won't get in trouble with Stan because Chris is actually the podcast guest for Equity Arc in a month. So I imagine that'll be up on the EA website, in the coming some weeks.
Yes, it'll be coming soon. It was Chris Jenkins in conversation with Oberlin student Solomon Leonard. They both play viola, and it's a great intergenerational conversation. Just looking at, what Chris Jenkins has learned from his time as the Dean of Student Support, and also Solomon's insight as a classical and jazz student on campus. Okay, we have another question. Does this affect race-based scholarships, fellowships, etc., or is it just the admissions process?
So I referenced this a little bit earlier, but the decision, of course, is made in the context of admissions decisions. And this goes to, I think it was Scott's point about risk tolerance. You could read the decision as being limited that way. that's a question about where your institution wants to fall in terms of how tolerant it is for risk in this area. I will say, though, I mentioned the Department of Justice and Department of Education joint guidance that was put out about this. There was also a briefing. So the guidance, written guidance that you can find online didn't mention financial aid scholarships largely, but at the briefing, this question came up, and I would just repeat the answer, which is this decision did not speak to financial aid and scholarships, but it was the position of the Department of Education and the Department of Justice that those programs and consideration of race and scholarships has always been legally questionable, and that it would be subject to the same analysis that I mentioned before in this decision. And so my reading of that is that scholarships, financial aid, and as I said before, other benefits are impacted by this decision, even though this decision itself was about admissions. It has a broader implication. But again, that's something you should discuss and review with your own internal counsel.
Tiffany, I have a follow-up question about that, sort of a thought question that you might have some perspective, because, you know, there's the issue of proxies, right? That could cut either way. And a proxy means that if you can't use race, maybe use a characteristic that will give you some of the same information a different way, like zip code. We can't have a scholarship that's exclusively for children of a certain race, but if we target it to this zip code, it's not about race, but we know we'll reach children of that race. And some people use that to say, great, we can build things this way, but there's also talk that this ruling from the Supreme Court kind of put us on notice that they're kind of watching the use of proxies and be more careful in the future.
Yes, so anybody that's familiar with, you know, the Chief Justice knows that he does things like this. He puts you on notice, and then 2 years later, you'll get a decision that says, I told you like 2 years ago that I was watching this. So what I will say is many of us who've been observing this were encouraged, because the worry was when this case went up to the Supreme Court that they would say something like, the pursuit of racial and ethnic diversity in and of itself is unconstitutional, because to have a goal that considers race violates Title VI in the Constitution. They didn't say that. What they said actually was that the goal of diversity and everything that comes with it is commendable, laudable, great, right? So we feel good about that they didn't go to the really scary place we thought they would go. But on this issue of proxies, I will mention that there is still some concern in the legal community about this, because there is a case coming out of Virginia. There's a very competitive high school in Virginia, and they revised their policies to be as race neutral as you possibly can get. It was all about zip codes. We're going to admit students from certain economically disadvantaged zip codes. We're going to get rid of standardized test scores, everything, no mention of race. But because they were doing all of these things for the express purpose of increasing diversity, so that the diversity of this very competitive high school could match the diversity of the community, they were sued by the same organization, saying that because they did all these race neutral things for the purpose of getting to diversity, that is not permissible. They won that case in the lower court. The appellate court reversed, but now they have asked the Supreme Court to consider that case. And so that is something that we're watching, because that's the next nightmare scenario, is that the court could come in and say, you can't do any of these things in order to reach the goal of racial and ethnic diversity, because that is unconstitutional. And all these things you're doing, zip codes, socioeconomic, they're really proxies for race, which is what you're really trying to get to. That could be on the horizon. All that I can say is this decision didn't say it. And so we should, again, in consultation with your internal counsel, feel comfortable to follow the law as it exists now, but being mindful that that is something that we may have to worry about in the future.
And I think this actually is a great way to kind of reiterate what Tiffany, Scott, myself, what all of us were just talking about just a few moments ago, as far as like the holistic approach to increase in diversity, so that we're not using proxies. I use the example of like a life experience through essay, or because the life experience can contribute to retention or you know, a resilient student, a strong student, kind of going as far away from race as you can, while also doing your targeted approach to get the audience that you're looking for. And so your school have to determine how. I can't speak on what to do because that's not my area, but I would second that motion of just being mindful. How your institution decides to move forward is certainly up to you, but I think you should certainly be mindful so that there's not potentially another setback if this decision does come forward in another couple of years. Start thinking now about that holistic approach to our outreach and to our way of not just recruiting students, but retaining them and creating a sense of belonging more holistically without the consideration directly of race in the decision-making process.
I saw a question in the chat from Melissa, and I just wanted to share that Colby Carson, our Director of Admissions at Eastman, is really having a calculated conversation with our faculty about how to use commentary and how to adjudicate our students when they do see them in person. And that's going to be a process that may take a while because there are some faculty that are like, I want this person because they're this race. I want this person because they're that race. And there's not a lot of people of that race on this particular instrument. And so one of the things that Colby is doing is actually reinforcing with our faculty that no aspect of race or ethnicity should be written in any audition commentary, none whatsoever. Because that's very important to understand that that shouldn't have been a part of the adjudication process in the first place, but it definitely cannot be now. And so really working with the faculty to really help articulate to them that it is going to have to be an artistic reference and nothing about their race, ethnicity that has any sort of bearing into how they choose which students they choose. And so it's a conversation that if it is not happening with faculty, should definitely happen with faculty at your institutions prior to the start of audition cycle. It's basically the same thing that legally we can and cannot do when we are looking at hiring people. We cannot, use their race and ethnicity as a part of our decision-making process. Is not something we can ask about, that sort of thing. So it really is helping our faculty to understand that they're not going to be able to do this. Oh, this is a Black oboe player, for instance, and that's rare, so we need to bring them in. That's not what the conversation needs to be about. It needs to be about artistic quality and making sure that because they meet the artistic standards that we're looking for, that's why we bring them in. So I hope that helps to answer your question, Melissa.
And I hate to be redundant, forgive me, everyone, but this is yet another example of why partnering with folks within your institution outside of your office is critically key. If you're able to, it might be beneficial to tap your counsel at your institution to help facilitate those conversations, to help guide those conversations, tag team the approach so that there isn't potentially a feeling of being overwhelmed with how to guide individuals. Certainly tap the resources that you likely have at your institution to collectively, come together and talk with faculty about how to move forward in this regard.
Awesome. And thank you, Scott, for answering that question in the chat about the resources for smaller organizations. We'll also be sharing some articles following this session as well for you to dive into further. But thank you again to our panel for sharing these insights and your expertise with us. And so we're going to move on to an interactive part of our time together. And we're going to open up 4 breakout rooms to give you an opportunity to discuss a topic that's particularly of interest to you. So here you'll be able to share and take away practical insights to consider and implement in your work. And also brainstorm how we can work together to create equitable pathways for musicians of color. So the topics that we have breakout rooms for are financial aid and scholarships, pre-college program partnerships, recruitment strategies, and supporting students of color while on campus. And so our amazing panelists will also be in those breakout rooms to help facilitate conversations, and they'll also be taking some high-level notes. And so you'll have about 20 minutes to discuss amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back, report out, and share any ideas that came up through your conversations. And so with that, I'll go ahead and open up the rooms, and just know that these rooms will not be recorded. Welcome back. All right, excited to hear what was top of mind for the breakout rooms. Maybe we can start with the financial aid and scholarships.
Yes, financial aid and scholarships, the best breakout room, because it's all about the money sometimes, but no, it was a great conversation. We talked about, on the ones from the collegiate people in the room, many of us weren't necessarily changing our policies around financial aid yet, unless in some cases there were some very specific inclusive based scholarships that were kind of narrowly written that had to temporarily be put aside. But what we did talk about was the positive form of change, and MSM talked about their partnership with Project 440, Joe Conyers' organization, and how one of the real great opportunities here is to be building these collegiate preparatory connections, that those, to use the word proxy, they're a type of proxy, but maybe they're a much more permissible type of proxy, because we're merely forming a relationship with another organization. They're vetting and deciding the goal, the parameters by which young people under 18 are participating in those programs. So that was something that came up. And the other thing, there was an interesting conversation about data, and like, how can you look at data on race, and who can look at data on race? And it tied in a little bit to that question someone posted in the chat earlier about, like, the idea that if you're a violin faculty sitting in an audition room with a violin student, there's a good chance you may be able to determine the race of that person just by, or at least have a hunch about it just by sitting with them there. So in some essence, it's like, we're not just like Harvard, where you're getting a piece of paper and you don't necessarily know the race, though of course there's a lot of research about proxies and cues and names and things like that sort of tie into implicit biases. But anyway, the data conversation was very, very interesting as well. And then we talked a little bit about audition repertoire. And again, one of these ideas of inclusive environment, how do we build, we're kind of veering a little bit from financial aid directly, but how can audition repertoire be a way to create a space that feels really welcoming for a lot of people to participate in your application and audition process?
Wonderful. How about the pre-college partnerships room?
Sharing out for our room. Hi, everyone. In this room, we had a few folks who were all from different areas having to do with pre-college programs, youth orchestra folks, and pathways program staff as well. We talked about what barriers we find in building relationships with prospective students of color at an earlier age, and spoke about systemic issues in school districts, lack of funding for music programs, those sorts of things. And we were offered a bit of a proactive solution in making space by welcoming in teaching artists who are people of color to sort of connect this mentorship and bring folks up that way. We also talked about strengthening relationships with our community by building relationship with schools and staff to connect more to younger music students there. And in response to the question about how equity art can help, we came up with a couple of different ideas, but mainly thinking that connecting with faculty in higher education would be really useful, so that when students get to these institutions, they have partners already. They already have friends inside and support like they're receiving in music education pre-college as well.
Thanks, Jade. How about the recruitment folks?
Yes, I can talk for the group there. We had a great discussion. Of course, it was much too short, and we were able to really share experience. I believe we were all working. We were all staff and professionals in various organizations in the room, and we were just sharing experiences on what we find are the most kind of critical features and what challenges as well that we've been facing. And there's no doubt that there are certain connections with teachers, for instance, that are very important for reaching students. And that's one thing that I think we all, for those who work in the field, sort of really rely on that. Student ambassadors as well, their ambassadorship to really spread the word about school and really have that personal connection is very, very, very important. And I think we sort of came back to the fact that, maybe the most effective recruitment strategy, or at least one of the most effective recruitment strategies, is really to nurture an environment at the school itself, to have the support necessary, to have the support inside of the program, and sort of the focus on making it a welcoming and open open community inside of each program as well. And that in itself is a recruitment strategy to create that environment that then can be talked about and that we can promote outwards. So those are a couple of comments. There might be others who would like to comment from the group as well.
Thanks, Elizabeth. All right. And for the last group, for the student support, especially supporting musicians of color while they're on campus, we had a great conversation as well. It was a group of mainly pre-college program administrators. And we also had someone in the room who has a degree in higher education administration. And so we were really talking about the dual need to empower students to advocate for themselves at a younger age. So before they even enter these institutions, and we talked about how that's done really well in Pathways programs. And then we also talked about the responsibility for institutions. We also added summer programs in the mix to kind of keep an ear to the ground to understand, what really is the student experience, especially for musicians of color, and be ready to address any problems that may arise. And so we talked about building those and strengthening those relationships, and it's also trust is a key part of that as well. And then we also talked about the importance of peer mentorship. So when a student does go on campus for the first time, how the importance for programs to connect current students with incoming students so that they can have someone to lean on and listen to that's not necessarily affiliated with the institution. And so there is just a huge conversation on the need for listening and collecting information and building stronger relationships. Right. So thank you all for taking this time to have these conversations amongst yourselves and also to listen to this session. I'm going to wrap up with some closing announcements. I'm going to let Crystal take the floor real quick to share some details on an upcoming event that's happening at Eastman.
Thank you so much for giving me the time to do this, Paula. Hello, everyone. I wanted to share with you that we have an event coming up at Eastman on November 3 and 4 called Context Conference 2023. One of the special things about this conference, and I'm going to put the link in the chat, is that it is one of the first ever equity and inclusion in music conferences that is being created outside of a music organization. So we are actually asking K through 12 instructors, higher education professionals, semi and professional music organizations, community music schools, and private studios to come together and have a conversation about what equity and inclusion means for our institutions and for the world of music moving forward. Under 5 categories: classroom innovation, curricular shift, performance practice, recruitment and retention, and community engagement. And so what I'd like to share with you today is if you are interested in being a part of this conference on November 3 and 4, anyone who joined us for this virtual call today will receive a discount for the registration fee. You'll simply have to do this by sending an email to my email, which is going to go into the chat, and say that you attended Equity Arc. And if you say that you attended today's symposium, you will receive $50 off of the registration fee. So we would love for you to be a part of this conference and to learn a little bit more about how we are advancing the conversation of equity and inclusion in music. So hope to see you November 3 and 4. Thank you so much for the time, Paula.
Thanks, Crystal. So on the Equity Arc side of things, so we've released our events calendar for the rest of the year, and our virtual events, they are free for Equity Arc members, and for non-members, they're typically $25. And so if you're interested in learning more about membership, you can visit equityarc.org or reach out to me at paula@equityarc.org to get that processed. So our next virtual event is a grant writing workshop that will be held on September 27th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. We're going to cover everything from grant research, grant making trends, and best practices for grant writing. After that, we're going to have our fall quarterly member meeting. That will be on October 25th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. There, we'll share our impact report from fiscal year 2023, and we'll also provide some updates on what's coming up in fiscal year 2024. We're also going to have time to welcome our new members and also network across the ARC. And then we're going to have an in-person event on November 16th or 18th. That will be the Building Bridges Symposium that we're co-hosting with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. They're celebrating their 30th anniversary of their talent development program. And so our theme for that symposium is connecting the pathways, because we're going to be exploring the musician's journey from pre-college to professional stages and how we can take a collective approach at each stage. And then our last event of 2023 is in December, where we will present the first ever Pathways Census Report. And for those of you who don't know, Pathways programs are intensive pre-college programs that are specifically for musicians from historically underrepresented backgrounds. And they provide really amazing resources, financial resources, mentorship, and just everything that a musician might need to be able to make it to that next level of conservatory training. And so we've compiled data and insights from members from our National Pathways Collective, and we look forward to sharing the impact of Pathways programs. That will be on December 13th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. Okay, so that's all. Thank you again to our panelists and attendees for making this session come to life. We'll follow up with some resources so that you can dive into that further, and we'll also share the recording for future reference. So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.